Welcome to State Affairs, and state your name and who you represent for the record.
My name is Bill Roden, and I'm here, I guess, on my own behalf. I do not represent any client with reference to this legislation, although, to the best of my knowledge, my clients don't object to this bill and would probably support it if asked. I was asked by the people who have sponsored this bill to review, if I would, the bill itself and try to answer any questions about the mechanics of the bill. In addition, I think it may be a little bit helpful, and I will try to not take very much time, Mr. Chairman, but a little bit of my background may be somewhat helpful for you. I served in when I was in the 9th grade and the 10th grade. I learned about the injustice that people can do to each other when we took the people of Japanese American descent and sent them to internment centers throughout the United States, in the western United States. In my 9th grade, I was the only Caucasian in my 9th grade. 10th grade, I think I had one other Caucasian in the 10th grade. And the rest of the time I was with the Japanese American students. My father was an employee of an agency called the War Relocation Authority. And my parents felt that, having grown up in Boise, in what's a much smaller town than it is now, that I need to find out something about what was going on in the world. And although I could have been sent to school in either Delta, Utah, or into Eden, my parents felt that I should experience, along with the Japanese Americans that were in the camp, what it was. And I think that was at a time when I became most concerned about injustices that can occur even with well-meaning and well-intentioned people. I served in the Army. I was in the Army Counterintelligence Corps, 2 years on active duty and 6 years in the reserves. And in that time, I investigated potential security risks. It was during an interesting time in our history with searching for communists under every Bush. And I was in the Subversive Activities Division in the Philadelphia office of the Counterintelligence Corps. And in that capacity, I had the opportunity, or the duty at least, to investigate potential security risks. And in those days, they classified people who were homosexual as being potential security risks. It was not an indictment so much of their orientation, but what the concern was at that time was whether or not, because it was considered to be so much in the closet or undercover, that those people would be a security risk because they would be subject to blackmail. When I was being discharged from the Army, I returned to Boise and went to the Ada County Prosecuting Attorney's Office at the height of a rather dismal part of, I think, Boise's history, where they were rounding up a lot of people in Boise for being homosexual and having engaged potentially in homosexual activities. I later became the prosecuting attorney in Ada County, and I changed the policy of the office, and we no longer engaged in that activity, other than any person who was involved with children or as non-consenting would be prosecuted, but that was gender neutral. If anyone involved with children in a sexual activity or in non-consenting situation, we would not prosecute. I then went to the Senate and had the opportunity to be one of the floor sponsors of the first Idaho Civil Rights Bill. And in 1961, we adopted the first legislation, which was rather sparse, and what it covered was race, creed, color, and national origin. Now, since that time in 1961, we've added some other things. In 1969, discrimination based on sex was added, together at that time with the creation of the Idaho Human Rights Commission. In 1982, we added discrimination based on age. Now, I have to point out, by the way, in full disclosure, I don't get the advantage of that exemption because I am over 70 and I'm not under 40, and I'm not under 40, but I'm not in the bracket that's protected, the 40 to 70 year bracket. I'm well past the age where I can claim discrimination if someone doesn't want to hire me. In 1982, we also added, or pardon me, in 1988, we added handicapped, and that was the term that was used in 1988. It's later been changed to persons with disabilities. In 1998, I think an interesting thing was done with the bill. And I say this only a background because I think it's important to understand the protections that are in the bill. Up until this time, we had a Human Rights Commission, and complaints could be made, but persons could also file civil actions based on those protections without going through the Human Rights Commission. In 1998, at the request of primarily, I think, of the business community, a statute of limitations was added by the statute requiring complaints of discrimination to be filed with the commission within 1 year of the alleged discrimination. More importantly, the 1998 statute required the filing of a complaint with the commission as a condition precedent to being able to file an individual civil action. And that provision still remains in the code today. So if a person feels that they are the subject of discrimination that is prohibited, and if you pass this bill, that would include the sexual orientation and gender identity, the protection is that you first take it to the Human Rights Commission, and they will examine the case, they will investigate it. The emphasis of the commission has always been on negotiation and mediation to try to resolve any differences. But first, and then they will examine it to determine whether or not they think there is just cause for the matter to proceed. If they give a determination that there was not just cause, they will give you an administrative dismissal of the complaint. That then allows the person then can proceed with an individual action, but the individual has to pay its own expenses, does not have the benefit of the backing of the Human Rights Commission. And that has been very successful. I think it's been, and from my information, it has been a very positive thing with the handling of complaints of discrimination. I've passed out to you, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but I do want to pass out to you, I passed out to you sections, the sections dealing with religious exemptions. Those are sections 67, 59, 10, sections 2A and C, and then paragraphs 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8 of that section. And those deal with exemptions for religious organizations to make it clear that the religious organizations can make preferences for members of their own faith. They can, there is no restriction on the beliefs that they can follow. And I think that the protections have been shown to be adequate. I've heard it expressed that pastors will not be able to speak freely from their pulpit on matters of public importance. That is just an absolute untruth. There is no restriction on the message that can be received in our churches and our synagogues and the cathedrals and the wards and steakhouses around the state. There have been a lot, I'm going to if I going through the bill, I think that basically the bill is very simple, as Representative Rushi has indicated. The bill merely adds the two terms sexual orientation and gender identity. To some extent, when I saw that, I wondered if that wasn't, maybe it was to protect all of us. We all have a sexual orientation. We all have a gender identity. Now, we know that that's not exactly what this bill is aimed at, but the fact of the matter is, it is neutral in its orientation. Mr. Chairman, I guess that to some extent I've always been a believer in fair disclosure and transparency. And at this time, I would like to close my remarks, but I think in fairness to the committee, I need to tell you something, one other thing about myself and my family. We see people every day as we go through life, and we do not know their sexual orientation. I'm not sure I would know their gender identity if I didn't, except for our parents, what I assume. But this is a way some people are. I happen to have a wonderful family. I have a daughter. I have 3 grandchildren. I have 5 great-grandchildren. And their sexual orientation, obviously, is heterosexual. I have a son who is employed in the state of Washington for a major consulting firm. He's been in a committed relationship for 23 years with the same partner. And I've never discussed this publicly before. I think it's important, though, if you want to judge my comments. He's one of the most outstanding young men that I've met. He's a loving, caring son. He earns money. He pays his bills. He helps people when he can. He's athletic. He competes in horseback riding events. He's a wonderful son. He doesn't need the protections of this bill. He lives in Washington, and when he comes to Boise, which is frequent, to visit many of his friends, who are not, by the way, of the same sexual orientation that he is, they have a great time together. And he has never been discriminated against, to the best of my knowledge. At least I've never heard him complain about it. But I think that the people need to be free from the fear of discrimination. They need to feel that they can rest comfortably in the right to have employment and be judged on their merits in that regard. They need to be able to be judged whether or not they care for their property. Mr. Chairman, I think this is good legislation. Idaho has a history of tolerance. I was going to tell you all about how we were the 4th state that finally recognized that women were not really protected by men at the ballot box, and we were the 4th state in the Union, well in advance of the national activity, to give women the right to vote. That was a vote against discrimination. And Idaho was a leader in that. In the 1980s, we finally were successful in removing the restrictions that were in the Constitution and we'd ignored it, against people who believed in celestial marriage. That wasn't removed from the Constitution until the 1980s, but it's gone now, and that's a good thing. I suspect that what we ought to do is pass House Bill 2, and I would ask you respectfully to do so.
Are there questions of Mr. Roden? Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roden, as you're giving your presentation, I did a quick web search, and terms and language are extremely important. So I want to know from your perspective, what does the term sexual orientation mean? And what does the term, and how do you define the term gender identity?
Mr. Roden.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Crane, I can't give you a definition. I think I know it. It's sort of, it's one of those things you know it when you see it. Sexual orientation, it just says that you cannot discriminate because someone may have a different orientation than the majority of the people. I think it could be also used in the other way to protect the majority of the people. Gender identity, I don't know. I did not draft this bill, by the way. I probably would have tried to define it, but I think it's difficult to define.
Follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roden, on the term sexual orientation, as I did a web search, it comes up tendency or inclination or preference, one's preference. If we're going to add this to code or to statute, I think we need to understand what that term means. So where would you draw the line as to one's sexual preference?
Mr. Roden.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Crane, in terms of sexual preference or sexual orientation, I would not draw the line so long as the person that is alleging discrimination has not engaged in illegal conduct, has not harmed his fellow man or woman, but merely because that preference may exist, that should not be the grounds for discrimination. Illegal conduct should always be the grounds for punishment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Roden.
Further questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Wintrow.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Roden, thank you so much for your presentation. In regard to Representative Crane's question, he's asking about a definition for sexual orientation and maybe a list of what that means. However, when we look at the act, do we list a number of races or religions in that act as well? Do we define religion, race, creed?
Well,
Mr. Roden.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Wintrow, none of those terms are defined in the code. Creed is not defined. Religion is not defined. None of those terms are defined terms in the Human Rights Code. But that's true with many things that we have in the code. There is not an actual definition, and it is developed over time with experience.
Further questions? Thank you, Mr. Roden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.